Please like and subscribe to this channel and press the bell icon to get new video updates.
My background is a systems engineer in RF, and I got wrapped up in this law enforcement surveillance stuff right off because out of RIT, I got hired into the Motorola Specials group down in Florida. And this was the group that built all the things that Motorola didn't want to build. Motorola just wanted to sell handheld radios to police. They did not want to build specialty stuff. But when NYPD calls up and they say, hey, we want to order 7,000 handhelds, but we also need two 25-watt repeaters in attaché cases, they would send those to us and we would build those little mini repeaters, that kind of thing. So I was immediately working in this world right out of college. And I've been bouncing back and forth between this world, commercial, automotive, and defense. I've had to have security clearances off and on for different jobs all through my career. And I got interested in the history of law enforcement surveillance because all we hear about this is legal situations, the legality of wiretaps, the legality of Big Brother. And everything that's been written or talked about has to do with, is it right to even do it? What are the protections under the Fifth Amendment, under the First Amendment, and so on? There's almost nothing about, hey, who designed this stuff? What is this stuff? And what's the technology? There was nothing out there. And basically, when you're talking about surveillance equipment, the cops aren't going to tell you about it either because they want to keep it secret so they can use it over and over again to gain evidence. So communications electronics developed after World War II, a lot of new stuff. The spy sets had been developed during the war, subminiature vacuum tubes by Raytheon, small microphones, batteries started to become smaller. Eventually, we got printed wiring boards, printed circuit boards, solid state. All of these things together made miniaturization possible. And of course, FM with Major Armstrong had already proven itself. We're going to be getting into active phone tapping, carrier current, and wired wireless, being able to send messages through power lines and telephone lines surreptitiously. And the tape recorder really comes into its own after World War II. So if you talk about the basic room bug, you've got a target room and you run a microphone over into that room and you try to conceal it in something like a smoke detector or a small pinhole in the wall. Or you could use a contact microphone, which is called a spike mic. And you just pound that into the wall. If you can find a 2x4, even better. The entire wall becomes the microphone. And now you can send it into an amplifier. You can monitor it at what's called the listening post or the LP. The LP is a manned station that is listening to the target's audio or observing the video of the target. You could also have an unattended situation where you have a transmitter or a tape recorder that has a Vox built in, so it doesn't actually use up any tape until there's actual activity in the room. Typically, if you need to get evidence, you can't use a tape machine that could be altered. So the FBI like to use what were called the Presto recording turntables to do all of their recordings on vinyl disc. Recording, and I've seen a lot of this at the AWA conference. There's a lot of people in the AWA that are interested in the history of recording. So you've probably seen some of this stuff before. But Gelosco in Italy, wire recorders in this country, especially with Webster and other companies that made dictaphones. And then the Presto company in New York City that was doing the cutting recorders for vinyl disc. All of the tape technology came out of Nazi Germany in World War II. They were way ahead of us with tape recording. This stuff was brand new. We were still using wire recorders pretty much through the 50s. The Germans had already gone to particle tape. They had already developed the rotating head technology for burst CW transmissions. You can change the rate of a burst transmission using a rotating head. And of course, the rotating head was the whole secret behind the videotape recorder, which would come later on in the 60s. German company Uhr was the darling of most of the federal agencies in this country. We were using Uhr recorders for a lot of the work. Now, if you need to have evidence and you're using a tape recorder, the lawyer can always say, perhaps it's been tampered with. So somebody came up with this thing called a walkie-record-all, and it uses a tamper-proof band for one-time recording. And this was actually able to be used in court as a tamper-proof type of recording. And these are really interesting little boxes that were used in the 50s and 60s. And of course, you might have heard of the Nagra. This is the Swiss company that developed the first on-body tape recorders. These were very popular all around the world for both, the intelligence gathering as well as police. And only the federal agencies in this country could afford such a machine as a Nagra. The Miniphone was an interesting device. This is also a recorder, but it's a wire recorder. And why would we use a wire recorder when tape recording on plastic was already available? Well, because that wire is about as thin as the human hair, and that Miniphone could go for hours and hours and hours recording speech mostly, not high fidelity, but evidentiary intelligence gathering with a wire type recorder as late as the late 60s. Gelosco stayed in the game. Most of the surveillance that was done by law enforcement in the 20th century was done through telephone tapping, not through wireless and not through planting microphones. Why would you do all of the work of actually planting microphones when you could just simply listen to someone on the telephone? You're going to get really good information by tapping the phone. And there's many different ways of taps. The simplest taps, of course, are either a parallel connection to the line or a series connection to the line. Obviously, with the parallel connection, you want it to be not detectable, so you need to have a capacitor so you don't short out the line. Somebody could measure the coil and say, hey, somebody's across this line. The series, of course, is just the opposite. You want to have as low an impedance as possible if you're going in series with the line. And these go out to headphones or the recorder. This is just showing some of the different ways that you can tap a telephone. You could do it right at the premises in the instrument itself. You could be at the outside of the premises. You could be on the line, up the pole. You could be at a terminal box. And you could have another terminal box where you've got your tape recorder or your monitor set up, and that's called the tapper's plant. Now, if that's unattended, the tapper's plant simply waits for the number to be called, starts the recorder, and then when the call drops, it stops the recorder. But of course, the most elegant way was to actually have it done right at the telephone exchange. When you're at the instrument itself, you could use an inductive method, picking up the dynamic earpiece of the telephone through a loose coupled method. This pickup coil could be secreted into a blotter, perhaps on a desk. The wire is in the blotter, the telephone is on the desk, and the blotter itself becomes the pickup coil. So these induction coils were quite a popular way to tap a phone without actually going into the phone. Gadgets were built once solid state became available that were small enough that the actual technical investigator could bring this equipment with him and do the tapping in an adjacent room. It could be a hotel room, or it could be just down the street, tapping into the line. And these little gadgets were available in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. The pen register is almost as old as telegraphy. Basically, it's a motor attached to a device that can punch holes, and it can be used to record CW, or it could be used to record the numbers that you're dialing on the telephone. So a pen register basically tells you what number you're calling, and these have been around since the 1800s. So tapping a phone by just getting across the wires, going into an amplifier, and then into a recorder or a pair of headphones is interesting. But that means that you've got to actually attach to the line, close to the premises. You may have to go into the premises, in fact. And the Bureau, the FBI, in their lab, they had developed this way that they could actually light up the line with a frequency, and then it would be a high enough frequency that it would be able to jump the leaf switches in the phone. So even though the phone is not online and these are not closed, the RF could go through the leaf switch like a capacitor, and therefore the audio could be used to modulate the carrier, and then you could detect the carrier with a detector and send it into the recorder. So this was called a telmic, and it's an ingenious way of tapping a phone and turning the carbon microphone of the telephone into a surveillance microphone without the phone even ringing or being online. This was developed in 1945, and it was manufactured by Research Labs in Connecticut, and it was operational. This was a lot of controversy over this device, and the patent was classified. So they did not allow this patent to go out into the world. It was a classified patent, and they were using 90 kilohertz for the carrier, and that's a very popular frequency range for any type of over power line, over wire, where you want to put a carrier on there and not have it detectable. I worked on a system in the 90s where we were using a spread spectrum carrier at this same frequency, believe it or not, plus or minus about 10 kilohertz. And we were going through transformers, and the Coke machines were all talking to each other so that you could know how many bottles of Coke you needed to deliver to the machine, and it talked right through its AC line cord using these carriers. So tapping at the instrument became really a popular way of bugging a phone once you had RF involved. So you had bugs that were actually RF bugs that would hook up to the phone, and they would transmit a short distance to where you had your receiver. But there was this guy, Manny Middleton in New York City, that came up with an ingenious device called the harmonica transmitter. And the harmonica transmitter basically had a tone decoder, and the tone decoder would turn on a very sensitive microphone and automatic gain control system in the phone, and you wouldn't even know that the phone had been called. I could be anywhere in the world and call that phone, and instead of the phone ringing, you dial the first, say, 7 numbers, but the 8th number that actually makes the phone ring, instead, you play the harmonica at note high C. And when you play the harmonica at high C, the tone decoder would turn on the microphone and put it down the line. It's pretty clever, huh? So basically, I could bug the phone just by playing the harmonica as the last digit of the phone number. It's called a harmonica bug. This caused all hell to break loose with Congress when they found out about it. And these, of course, were what were used in the Watergate break-in. 4 phones in the room had harmonica bugs in them, and the smoke detector in the room had a wireless bug. The receiver that was used was a Watkins Johnson to pick up the wireless bug. And all of this was available from spy shops, by the way. The Watergate team did not want to use commercial equipment that was used for law enforcement for the actual bugs. They wanted to use stuff you could get at spy shops. But every other piece of equipment in Watergate was professional. All of the logistics, the repeaters, the receivers, the two-way radios were all law enforcement grade agency type equipment, but not the bugs themselves. They were all junk. That made them not traceable. Another way is to put RF bugs inside the instrument. And you can have parallel bugs that actually take power from the phone. And it's really an infinity bug at that point because it's powered off the actual phone line. You don't need to change batteries. Some of them, of course, do have batteries. So you have to get to the instrument to change batteries now and then. The ultimate one was an actual carbon microphone replacement module that had a transmitter built in. So the secretary could unscrew the microphone of any phone, and the secretary could drop in the replacement and turn it back. And now the secretary has just bugged the phone for you. And you have your receiver outside the room. And that's a clever little device. The first telephone line transmitters, where you hook up to the line and it transmits RF, actually came during the tube era. This is a receiver by a company called Mosler, and this is a tube-type transmitter from the 50s. And they sold these up through probably the mid-60s. And of course, they converted to solid state. But these sub-mini tubes that Raytheon came up with for hearing aids and later for the proximity fuse during World War II, and the Motorola handheld radio that you guys probably know about, the BC611, I believe, the handheld Motorola, all use these sub-mini tubes. Here is a tube-type body-worn transmitter from 1952. And of course, this would use not only the 1.5 volt cells to light the tubes, but you also needed 3 45 volt cells for the high voltage for the tubes. This is narrowband FM in the 39 to 76 megahertz band. Of course, most police were in this low band at that time. And they also made some other types of transmitters for on-body use. This is the Fargo Company from San Francisco, and this is Mosler Research from Connecticut. And these are all 1950s style police body-worn type transmitters for wiring up the confidential informant, sending them into the mob or into the drug bust or into the prostitution ring or the gambling situation, and being able to monitor the audio both for evidence, security, and for officer safety. And then Motorola got in the game with body wires in the 1960s. Notice they're using VHF 144 to 174 megahertz body wires. It's very rare to find this stuff, by the way. Keep your eyes open for this stuff. It's very, very rare. And here's an FM receiver to pick up these body wires. This is a 16-tube double conversion superhet, all sub-mini tubes, and it's 10 inches by 6.5 inches by 1 3/16. And this is the 50s. This is a micro miniature 16-tube double conversion superhet. So, of course, the feds want everything. They want all of these gadgets. So where did the money come from to be able to buy such wonderful devices? And was there enough money to get all these companies started to build all this stuff? And of course, it started with LBJ. It was going to be the war on poverty. You guys might remember that, the war on poverty. But it turned into the war on crime as he got, well, let's just say he was not as happy during the Vietnam situation as when he got the presidency when JFK was assassinated. And it became the war on crime. Then we had the war on drugs from Nixon in 1971. And of course, the Reagan Anti-Drug Abuse Act in 86. All of this meant lots of dollars for police, law enforcement, technical investigative equipment. The major manufacturers in the 60s and 70s changed from spy shop type stuff to formal companies that sold only to law enforcement and agencies. They did not sell to the general public. There were laws in place. Title III came 1968, and there was this new thing called an expectation of privacy, where you actually have to get a court order in order to do surveillance. Up to 1968, the government considered most of this to be the capture of words. So you were stealing only words which were not as valuable as actual things. So the cops could pretty much do all types of surveillance up until the Title III laws came about. Once the Title III laws came about, all this equipment became able to be protected and kept from the general public. You could not buy it anymore. It had to be registered, kept in depots, and very carefully manufactured. And to this day, this type of equipment, should it show up on eBay, usually the Bureau will call the company that manufactured it. They'll call the eBay guy, they'll offer him some money and buy it back, and then destroy it. Even if it's 25 or 30 years old, it leaves eBay, and it usually either goes to a museum or it gets destroyed to this day. These are some of the companies that were active. So I told you about Bernie Spindell and his spy shop in Manhattan. He would sell to anybody. And of course, everybody was using his gear. And he's the one that came up with that harmonica bug. And this is Bernie and Jimmy Hoffa, for instance, here. He was involved on both sides of the fence, both in the detection of bugs and the production of bugs. So he had a good business going, and he was featured in Life magazine, and he testified to Congress about surveillance systems. This was one of the other players, Leo Jones, Fargo Company in San Francisco. He started to really formalize once the laws were set in motion. And this is one of his early kits. It's called an attack kit. This is basically, everything you need to do a black bag job. What is a black bag job? That's where you go into a premises and you install bugs and different types of surveillance equipment. So here's everything in one little bag for you. And he started doing this in the 50s, actually. So it's really interesting how sophisticated this got. Charlie Kagan was a consultant. Charlie, I've done a lot of research on him. He was basically one of these beltway guys that was smarter than everybody else, and everybody used him as a consultant. He invented the offset weight vibrator that makes your phone vibrate. Now, how important would that patent be? That's an important patent. He invented the magic eye for Polaroid that focused the camera automatically and set the light. That's in your phone too, by the way. And he designed on-body transceivers for Titan missile bases and so on, underground communicators for tunnels. He founded Kagan Electronic Labs in the late 50s, early 60s, and he started to make these kits. And he made body wires, which are transmitters that you tape onto people's bodies with a microphone, a high-gain microphone. And he made the listening post security kits, the SK1, the SK2, and you can see these have recording, they have receivers, the actual transmitters part of the kit, and you're all set. You got an attaché case, you're ready to go. Another major player in the really in the 50s through 70s was this man called Jack Holcomb. Jack, he claimed he was not in the agency. He was not in the CIA. And the more he claimed that, the more you assumed he was. He was involved with supplying materials for lots of coups that occurred in the Caribbean and Bay of Pigs and things like that. He was a guy that moved the things around in the Caribbean, supposedly for U.S. agencies. We don't really know. But he was also a real estate magnate, meaning when it came to islands and things like that, he knew what was available and how to get real estate. He became a surveillance device manufacturer in the 60s, and he wanted to take advantage of some of that money that the federal government was putting out for law enforcement. He went as far as to found the National Intelligence Academy on Fort Lauderdale Beach. He bought an old hotel and turned that into the training facility. And this facility was so sophisticated, it included a full mock-up of a neighborhood. The police would actually send teams down there to learn how to wire up a neighborhood for phone, wireless, learning how to track with direction finders. He had a room that had telephone poles in it with lines where you could learn how to tap lines right in the premises. This was a huge deal. And he had one of the best engineers out there, this guy Hans, who came from Weingard. And he made so much money after he retired, he bought a Caribbean island and retired there. Now, this is a man I worked with right at the end of his career. So when I left Motorola Special Products, I came to work just as this guy was selling his company. He definitely was connected. He talked to me about being an operative in Beirut and French Indochina in the 50s when the French controlled Vietnam. He talked to me about using the GRC-9 on the roof of an embassy with somebody cranking the crank as he was sending stuff out by code. This was a real Cold Warrior type. And he was hired on. Kagan Electronic Labs sold to Bell and Howell. So Charlie Kagan got out of the business and he sold to Bell and Howell, who wanted to get into this very lucrative law enforcement market. So Frank was brought into Bell and Howell to be like a group leader, an engineering leader. He was an engineer. And he grew the business to 300 people in this law enforcement group called the Special Operations Group of Bell and Howell. The Special Operations Group was a little company that did not exist. You've never heard of this. You never heard that Bell and Howell was one of the biggest surveillance equipment manufacturers in the world. That's how quiet it was. He eventually left Bell and Howell and started his own company called Tactical RF. Tactical RF was on the South Shore of Boston, so he didn't go very far. And he sold to Dynatech, and that's when I came on board. So my job with Frank was to take everything that was in his head and make it into a training course that we take on the road to kind of kick off the new company and get the cops to trust us with the old technology from Bell and Howell. So another major player was Bill McEwen. And Bill, he was also a Cold Warrior, definitely CIA. He started a company called Security Intelligence Communications, SIC. He actually did repair and warranty work for the Bell and Howell Special Operations Group. And he would sell kits and do contracting with federal agencies. And basically, he's the one that provided the Watergate team with all of their logistics equipment. It was all Bell and Howell equipment, their two-way radios, their repeaters, and so on. Bill provided all of the equipment to them. The actual bugs themselves, again, were provided from a spy shop situation. Now, the break-in team, the federal agencies investigating Watergate, and even the movie that was made afterwards all used Bell and Howell gear. It's kind of interesting when everybody's using the same very good quality gear. As a matter of fact, during the Watergate investigation, he was brought in and he had all the paperwork that, everything had been bought. It was all legally bought through, the company. And the fact that it was illegally used had nothing to do with the equipment manufacturer or his company that repped it. He ended up providing the radios and the RF consult to the movie All the President's Men, as well as Dirty Harry. And you can see the Special Operations Group transceivers are being used here. They're ultra thin, much thinner than any Motorola gear at that time, because they use surface mount technology and hybrid devices. This is another man I worked with, Norv Stapelfeld. He was another 128 Boston Beltway consultant. He was a Bell and Howell engineer in the late 60s and 70s, and his specialty was really high performance receivers, secure remote control, like a car kill. If you have someone that you're following and you want to take them into custody after they've actually committed the crime, like opened the box of drugs or given the vital information or shot the person, you need to do it in a safe manner, and you do that at a pinch point that's safe so there's no accident. Well, he developed the system that you put inside the car that will kill the car's engine and safely stop the car, with the press of a button from the following vehicle. It's called a car kill. He also developed tracking systems, and he was the chief engineer on LoJack. You might have heard of the LoJack car recovery system. Norv developed that. He just passed away last month. So the early bugs, of course, the early body wires by Bell and Howell used fairly special batteries, two 7.5 volt batteries, because this is germanium based equipment from the 1960s. And they were having trouble getting RF to work at VHF without using fairly high voltage at that time. Now, as time goes on, we start to do VHF and we can use much lower voltages. This is a T70 body wire. And basically you have a little pouch and you tape this onto the person's body. You put the microphone underneath and put a Band-Aid over the mic or whatever. And this is what you send in the confidential informant in to do the buy. And Bell and Howell, of course, and DTC that developed this, and TRF, these are all the same line, meaning they all followed the same ancestry. But Jack Holcomb, his company had a completely different line, and he was pointed more at the state and local cops, and he wanted them to be able to go into the drugstore and get the batteries rather than having to have specialty batteries. And that worked very well for the state and locals who couldn't afford to have a depot and change out batteries and have specialty batteries. So it turned out that the Bell and Howell type systems were more for federal government, and the audio intelligence devices out of Fort Lauderdale were more for the state and locals. Here's a couple of the attaché cases that were done by the Bell and Howell Special Operations Group. This is an SK-8. You might remember Shally Kagan, Shally Kagan, SK-1 and SK-2. Well, this is later in the game. This would be the late 60s, and this would be in the 70s. And I just saw one of these. I was watching one of the Americans, and the Americans had one of these in the trunk, and they had the antenna deployed, and they were recording right out front of a building where they had the bug, and they were using it properly. So they must have some really good props to be able to get this really good equipment for the show. So this is a T70 body wire, developed about 1969. As you can see, it's surface mount technology. This one's built a little later, you can tell, but the size hasn't changed. This is very thin sheet metal. This is fly cut aluminum. The sheets slide in and click, and the battery is exactly the same size as the transmitter, and it slides on, so you can quickly slide on the battery pack. So here's the kinds of things that they were doing in 1970. They were using those powdered iron cores that we just discovered about 10 years ago on ham radio, right? Everybody's using these powdered iron now to build their equipment. Well, they've been around a long time. These are micro miniature toroids. These are SOT23 transistors. Basically push-pull pair into a transformer. Micro miniature trimmers. This is a pi network on the output. And these are narrowband FM transmitters, these body wires. Here's a 2-watt. I designed this. This is a Motorola Final. I learned about this transistor when I was in Florida and put it into this device. This is an automatic gain control, thin film hybrid using surface mount devices. And this allows the microphone to work good with the body wire. Here's your oscillator. Your FM varactor and so on is on this module. So it's an oscillator doubler. Then it goes into another doubler stage, and then into the final, and then into the driver. And the driver is about 100 milliwatts here, goes into the final and out at 2 watts. So it's a nice little transmitter. And finally, tracking and bumper beepers. Now, basically, if you can pop something on somebody's car, that was something that didn't require a court order. There was no problem popping these things on people's cars until the states wised up and started to put laws in place where you do need a court order to put something on somebody's car. But for the longest time, you could just pop a magnetically attached transmitter like this. And this thing has, it's got mercury switches in it that detect if the car stopped or moving, and it puts out blips that are similar to the wildlife tracking blips. The blips are so fast they won't open the squelch on a radio, but the direction finder, of course, is able to get a left-right indication, and eventually pseudo-Doppler, where you could get an angle of arrival from the transmitter. And now you can track that car. I used to do a lot of cat and mouse with things like this. Training the cops, you put this thing on the cop car, and then you have the tracker on the follow vehicle, and he tries to get away from you in the city. It's a lot of fun tracking them with something like this. So this is as far as I went really with my presentation for the annual review for AWA, because I did not want to get into more modern police techniques. Everything that I've discussed with you so far is fairly ridiculous in today's law enforcement, where we have the internet, we have the modern phone, we have GPS, and so many other techniques. That all of these things I've talked about represent the history of law enforcement surveillance.
Please like and subscribe to this channel and press the bell icon to get new video updates.